Some fighters fail because they were never good enough. Others fail because they arrive just as the world stops needing what they were built to be. The Martin-Baker MB.5 belonged to that second category, and that is what has kept its name alive long after its chance had passed. On paper, it looked like the sort of British fighter that should have mattered. In the air, it showed enough to prove that the promise was real. It was fast, powerful, heavily armed, and engineered with a level of practical thought that test pilots and ground crews could both appreciate. More than one experienced pilot came away convinced that Britain had something unusually capable on its hands. And yet, the MB.5 never entered squadron service, never fired a shot in combat, and never got the one thing that turns a great prototype into a legend: time. That story had begun years earlier, when James Martin and Captain Valentine Baker founded Martin-Baker in 1934. Nothing about the company suggested it would one day challenge the top tier of British fighter design. It was not Hawker, with its standing and production strength. It was not Supermarine, whose Spitfire would become the standard every new interceptor would be measured against. Martin-Baker was smaller, less secure, and operating far from the center of power in the industry. What it had was nerve. Martin and Baker were willing to aim at problems that should, by all appearances, have been left to larger firms. That mattered when the Air Ministry issued Specification F.18/39, calling for a high-speed single-seat fighter suited to a war that was already reshaping military aviation. This was not a safe contract for a modest firm. It pointed beyond the aircraft Britain already had and towards something faster, harder hitting, and more versatile. Martin-Baker chose not to treat that as a warning. It treated it as an opening. The result was the Martin-Baker MB.3, and on the drawing board, it looked like the kind of airplane that could force people to take a small company seriously. The design was first tied to the Rolls-Royce Griffon, because any fighter meant to compete at the top of the next generation needed real power behind it. But war scrambled schedules and exposed how fragile even excellent plans could be. The Griffon was not going to be ready in time, so the project had to change course, and the airplane ultimately took shape around the Napier Sabre instead. Even that did not erase what made the MB.3 special. Its promise was not limited to horsepower and speed figures. Martin and Baker had also thought hard about the reality of keeping combat aircraft alive under wartime pressure. The MB.3 was designed with maintenance and repair in mind, using detachable panels and a structure that made servicing and transport easier than on many RAF aircraft then in service. That may sound less glamorous than top speed, but it mattered in exactly the way serious fighter design should matter. They were not just drawing a fast airplane, they were drawing a usable weapon. When the MB.3 finally flew on August 31, 1942, with Valentine Baker at the controls, it showed enough to justify the years of effort behind it. For a brief moment, it looked as though Martin-Baker had done what few expected a company of its size to do. Then the story broke apart almost as quickly as it had come together. On September 12, 1942, Baker was taking off when the Napier Sabre failed. He tried to bring the aircraft down in an emergency landing beyond the runway, but the MB.3 struck an obstacle, crashed, and killed him. That was not just the loss of a prototype, and not just the death of a test pilot. It was a blow to the company, a blow to the project, and a blow to the entire path Martin-Baker had been trying to follow. MB.3 did not die because it lacked promise. It died before that promise had the chance to mature. James Martin chose not to let it end there. What followed was not a simple rebuild. Martin went back through the design with the kind of clarity that comes when a project has already shown both its potential and its cost. There was, for a time, an intermediate paper proposal called the Martin-Baker MB.4, built around the Bristol Centaurus radial, but that version never left the drawing board. The real successor was the Martin-Baker MB.5. Its engine changed to the Rolls-Royce Griffon-83, driving contra-rotating propellers and giving the fighter a different character from the Sabre-powered MB.3. The armament settled at 4 20mm Hispano Mark II cannon. Yet the deeper continuity mattered more than the list of revisions. Martin kept the central idea that a fighter had to be practical as well as fast. The MB.5 retained the emphasis on accessibility, detachable skin panels, modular construction, and the kind of maintainability that could save time when time mattered most. It should not be understood as merely MB.3 with another engine on the front. It was a more mature answer to the same question, shaped by everything Martin had already learned. Even then, promise still had to survive contact with reality. With Baker gone, the principal test flying of the MB.5 fell to Brian Greenstead of Rotol Limited. In May 1944, the completed prototype was moved to RAF Harwell, and before it ever made its strongest case in the air, it made a quiet one on the ground. It could be disassembled, transported, reassembled, and returned to flight with remarkable speed. Exactly the sort of practical intelligence Martin had been trying to build into the airplane from the beginning. Then came the first flight, and with it, the first hard disappointment. Greenstead did not come back, talking as though he had just found an overlooked masterpiece. He found the MB.5 directionally unstable and was sharp in his criticism. For a design that had already taken so long to reach this stage, that mattered. It would have been easy at that point to start telling the comforting story that sometimes gathers around doomed prototypes. That the airplane was brilliant, the world simply failed to see it, and fate did the rest. Martin did not take that route. He treated Greenstead's criticism as a problem to be solved. He studied the reports, tested changes, and worked through the aircraft's behavior carefully, including enlarging the vertical tail to restore authority compromised behind those large contra-rotating propellers. The work took time, but when the MB.5 flew again, the handling had improved markedly. It was not admirable because it arrived perfect. It was admirable because it proved it could be refined into something genuinely formidable. Once its worst issues were brought under better control, the airplane's real quality became harder to dismiss. The Martin-Baker MB.5 was not merely handsome by prototype standards. It was, in the ways that counted, a very capable fighter. Its speed was impressive, its altitude performance strong, and its range respectable enough to make clear that this was not some narrow experiment. The wide track landing gear gave it a more forgiving personality on takeoff and landing than narrower track RAF fighters, and pilots who had spent time in demanding wartime aircraft understood the value of that immediately. The contra-rotating propellers helped here as well, reducing torque effects that could make powerful single-engine fighters difficult to handle. None of this erased every flaw. Some directional instability lingered. The MB.5 never became a miracle airplane, but that is exactly why the praise it earned has weight. It did not come from people eager to romanticize a failure. It came from pilots who knew good airplanes, bad airplanes, and false reputations when they met them. Janusz Zurakowski was strongly impressed by it. Captain Eric Winkle Brown was too, and Brown's judgment mattered because he was not speaking as a dreamer in love with what might have been. What struck him was not simply that the MB.5 was good. It was that it had made its first flight as early as it had and still stood out. By the time the MB.5 was ready to demonstrate its full value, however, it was no longer answering the world that had first called for it. It was answering a world already moving past it. By late 1944, the war in Europe was approaching its final phase. The RAF was no longer desperate for a new piston-engine fighter, no matter how capable that fighter might be. At the same time, the next era was beginning to show itself clearly enough that the old logic of fighter development was changing under everyone's feet. The future was turning toward jets. That was the real verdict on the MB.5. Lingering technical imperfections did not help it, but they were not what truly killed it. History did. By the time the aircraft was ready to prove how good it could be, the need for exactly that kind of excellence was fading away. So the MB.5 never got the production order that might have changed its place in aviation history. Instead, it passed into the quieter afterlife that often waits for aeroplanes which arrive just after their moment. It continued flying in tests, demonstrations and training roles, and each of those appearances only deepened the sense that something valuable had been missed. At RAE Farnborough, it showed what it could do without ever being allowed to become what it had been built to be. It flew before Winston Churchill, which feels fitting in retrospect because few figures better understood how much of war turns on timing. After that, the path narrowed still further. The airplane moved to RAF Wattisham, then to RAF Bircham Newton, and there it met an end far below the quality of the machine itself. Rather than being preserved as a landmark in British fighter development, it was used as a ground target and eventually destroyed. No original Martin-Baker MB.5 survives. Only a replica remains to suggest what the real aircraft looked like. That would be a bleak place to leave the story if it ended with the airplane. But it did not. Martin-Baker pushed a little farther with the MB.6 and MB.7, then left fighter design behind. James Martin, shaped in no small part by the loss of Valentine Baker, turned the company toward ejection seats and escape systems, work far less glamorous than designing a frontline fighter, but far more enduring in its consequences. That became the company's true legacy. Not a production fighter, not a wartime victory tally, a long record of keeping pilots alive. That is why the MB.5 still matters. It stands as one of the clearest examples of an aircraft that could do almost everything right and still lose because the world had moved on. It never became the fighter of its age, but out of that failure came a different Martin-Baker, one built not around the glory of combat, but around the chance to survive it.